2012 calendar controversy to briefly debunk some of the sort of major fallacies about that controversy, but mostly use it as a platform to talk about how the Maya conceptualize and use time. And also to talk about their calendrics and about the system of cyclical time that they're so well known for. Move back here. I want to offer a brief caveat too. Shania introduced me as a Mayan scholar. That's actually not quite the case. I'm more truthfully a scholar of Southwestern archaeology and culture, and I've done field work in the Southwest, but I've done some field work in Mesoamerica as well. And that sort of spurred, as a graduate student, and that spurred a lasting interest in Mesoamerica for me. And I've been teaching the Aztec and Maya and their predecessors course here at JMU for several years now. Without further ado, it's hard to talk about the Maya at all without taking a moment to think about what they mean to us culturally and historically. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Maya really captured the Western imagination, both in America and in Europe. And in particular, there was a journey to many parts of the Mayan world by two individuals, John Lloyd Stephens and Frederick Catherwood. Frederick Catherwood was a painter, and the images that he created of some of the ruined Mayan cities, and the Guatemalan jungle in particular, really captured the Western imagination in a way that launched scholarship, that launched interest by non-scholarly individuals, that launched a fascination with the mystery and the wonder of the Mesoamerican world in general. And the images that Catherwood provided to us of the Mayan landscape have found their way into our own cultural psyche in many ways. And they produce an image of a landscape that captures a lot probably of our own sort of deeper-seated fears and desires and imagination. Some of this landscape has infused itself into our modern pop culture as well. If you recall, if you see that coming towards us on the horizon, what is it? Yes, it's the Millennium Falcon. Star Wars, the movie, used Tikal to create its fictional planet of Alderaan. And this is just one example in the many ways in which we've sort of appropriated Mayan culture and the Mayan landscape. Of course, we reimagine the Mayan history and the Mesoamerican history more generally to tell stories about our own pasts and our own futures. The Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull movie is an example of that. Even when we're actually trying to tell stories about the Maya, we end up, often as not, telling stories about ourselves instead, about our fears and desires, of ends of times, of apocalypse, of judgment. And the 2012 controversy really ends up being, in many ways, sort of the extreme culmination of this tendency to use Mayan culture to talk ultimately about ourselves, to tell our own story through the filter of what we think we know or what we do know, in some cases, about the ancient Mesoamerican and Mayan world. The New Age phenomenon and the Maya 2012 calendar controversy has been is visible here in just a few of the very well-selling books that touch on this topic. What will happen? What do these prognosticators in their own right think will occur on December 21st, 2012? Well, their imaginations know no bounds. In the view of some, it will be apocalyptic destruction. In the view of others, will be a galactic alignment that may either produce, again, destruction, or something much better than that. It's possible that this will be accompanied by, or or replaced by the arrival of aliens. And it's possible, too, that there will be a transformation of consciousness, and this is the more positive note on which the New Agers sound on the 2012 calendar. Our evolution will be accelerated exponentially. Will attain a sort of a collective worldwide consciousness that will resolve world conflict and produce general sense of peace and well-being. That's certainly the one I choose. What do modern-day Maya folks have to say about this? This is a Guatemalan Mayan Indian elder who was interviewed recently. He says that he's getting a little tired of it. It would be sort of a little bit dishonest of me to try and tell this story as though New Agers were sort of the engines in themselves of the 2012 controversy. That's not the case. In fact, you can look back through time at some of the earliest Mayan scholars and see millenarian types of thinking associated with the Maya. One of the very first individuals to look at Mayan hieroglyphs thought that they were written by lost tribes of Israel. Others connected them in various ways to ends of times kinds of prophecies. Even one of the most revered figures in Mayan scholarship still alive today, Michael Coe, in a 1966 book on the Maya, a much later, more recent edition of which I've used as my own textbook in class, he wrote that the coming end of the 13th Baktun and the current great cycle of the Mayan calendar would involve apocalypse of some kind. So archaeologists and scholars are by no means innocent in this retelling of the Mayan story. Well, let's take a step back and think about how we do actually know about Maya time and Mayan ways of reckoning time in the more distant past, because of course it's the more distant, more ancient recollections of time that are at the heart of the Maya 2012 controversy. Well, one thing we have are Spanish accounts. In addition to burning a lot of the actual Mayan books, the Spanish wrote very extensive accounts that told in their own particular, or through their own cultural lens, the Mayan history. There are books written by the Maya themselves, post-conquest texts. They're actually written in the Spanish language, but written by Mayan people about Mayan culture and Mayan pasts. There are a very few, 3 to be precise, and a fragment of a fourth, actual Mayan codices remaining to us. Most of these were written in what is known as the post-classic period. This is after the so-called golden age of Mayan history. But these books are incredibly valuable to us in understanding a little bit about how the Mayan people constructed calendars and what they thought about time. There's also archaeological evidence. We have, in particular, what are known as stelae, stone monuments, which are part artwork and part historical record. Stelae are of all shapes and sizes, and they dot many of the classic period Mayan sites. So this is an actual record of Mayan history from that golden age in the Mayan past. A very famous stele, Stele 3 from the site of Piedras Negras, which shows in greater detail some of the hieroglyphs from that site. Glyphs, some with dates included, are also found on ceramic vessels, vases, on murals adorning the walls of sites like Banampa, and on ornaments worn by people. These jade ornaments, including things that you would wear from your ears, about your neck, many different types of costumes were worn by Mayan elite and royalty in particular, and these are inscribed with hieroglyphs, which you can't quite make out in this slide. You'll have to take my word for it. Other archaeological evidence, one of the most important categories of this evidence is what is known as E-groups, architectural alignments of temples and platform mounds which are thought to actually be placed in such a way as to capture very important periods of the solar cycle. In particular, the solstices, but also possibly the equinoxes. The E group essentially consists of one large pyramid to the west of the group, and then a long horizontal pyramid platform with 3 temples built atop it. This is the one from Washaktun, and you can see an image of that E group here standing atop that temple. And of course, much of the E group is obscured by vegetation today, but you see those 3 smaller temples on the other side of a clearing here that rest atop a mound that conceals the original platform mound. And this arrangement of buildings is thought to have this solar significance. Other buildings, including most famously the Caracal from Chichen Itza, a Yucatecan Mayan site dating to the classic and also post-classic periods, is thought to have been arranged, have been built with openings in it that would have created a very specific view shed, allowing an observer inside to see, in particular, the rising and setting of Venus. Well, so that's sort of the major categories that scholars use today to talk about how the Mayan pursued time and how they constructed calendars. I want to step back a little bit and put some of this into context by providing sort of a brief historical overwrap, sort of surrounding the time at which, during which the classic Maya created some of their most famous calendrical representations. This is on the left, the image here is of the Mayan Heartland, which includes certainly the entirety of the Yucatan Peninsula, which encompasses both a portion of Mexico and also the countries of Guatemala and Belize. The Mayan culture area extended to the south and the east, also into Honduras and as far as El Salvador. The heartland of the Mayan people, though, was the southern lowlands between the tall mountain ranges in northern Guatemala and the lower and drier Yucatan Peninsula. So the bulk of the classic period Mayan settlements that we'll be talking about today are in the southern lowlands area. This is when we think about the Maya and we think about 2012 and the Mayan calendar, we tend to have this image of the Maya as a single people, and that's in itself probably pretty erroneous. We know that today some 33 different languages are spoken in the Mayan area. In the classic period, things would have been a little bit more uniform, but still great diversity even then. The Mayan civilization, the Mayan cultural tradition, was built on a foundation of agriculture, and the agricultural practices of the Maya centered on something called the milpa. The milpa is essentially a method of garden farming, where corn, squash, and beans are all grown together in the same small plot of land, and each of these products complements the others. The ability for the Maya to sustain large populations of people using this technique, later amplified by irrigation and more intensive methods of farming, was really the reason for their ability to ultimately develop the very large cities that they did. To very briefly mention some of the key periods of Mayan history and prehistory. The modern era extends back somewhat arbitrarily by scholars to the era of Spanish conquest and following that. The post-classic era is the era that follows the very famous southern Mayan lowlands collapse, the collapse of Mayan civilization as we knew it. and that extends between about 900 AD, 1500 AD. The Classic period and the Pre-Classic period, extending between 900 BC and 900 AD, are what I want to talk briefly about next. The Pre-Classic Mayan era is this very long chunk of time, and really beginning quite early, in which the Mayan cultural tradition developed. And one site above any other exemplifies that development. It's the site of El Mirador in Guatemala. The El Mirador Basin is home to one of the largest Mayan settlements in either the Pre-Classic or Classic periods. This is the Dante Pyramid at the heart of El Mirador, and you can see the rainforest extending in all directions from it. It's been the site of excavations extending back over a decade now. This is an artist in the National Geographic imagining of what the heart of El Mirador might have looked like when this city was thriving. The heart of it consists of this complex of temples and pyramids and plazas in which major rituals and other ceremonies would have been held, with most of the residential structures in the periphery of this area. If you can make out some of the smaller maps above, and you can see that both within sites like El Mirador and also between sites like El Mirador and peripheral sites, there were systems of roads. The Maya did not have beasts of burden like horses or cattle, so they traveled on foot. These roads are called sacbe, and many of them are still visible today. We know from artifacts like this ceramic vase, which has hieroglyphs extending along one side, that the Pre-Classic Maya, not the Classic Maya, were the ones who actually developed the Mayan system of writing. And they in turn probably inherited that from even earlier groups such as the Olmec. Another staple of the Mayan cultural tradition, the ball game, began during the Pre-Classic period, and at El Mirador they developed some very large formal courts like the one pictured here. One of the interesting things about the Pre-Classic period and about cities like El Mirador was something called their monumental mask building program. And what that consisted of was the adornment on the facades of major temples and pyramids of enormous stone masks. I can get a sense of the scale there from that individual sitting beside one large nose, if you can make that out in the upper right. And here's an artist's rendering of what that might have looked like in one of the earlier Pre-Classic sites. And what's interesting about these masks in particular, if you can make out this individual here, you have a human face, but it's encapsulated within, you can see this larger supernatural animal here, which has bird-like characteristics. And then this one here in the middle, there is no fully human component to it at all. It's entirely a bird. And what this suggests is a theme of transformation. And if you know anything about shamanism, both worldwide or in the Mayan area, you know that one of the sort of the fundamental roles of the shaman was to enter the spirit realm, was to talk to the ancestors, to talk to the supernaturals, and one of the ways they did that was by either transforming themselves into spirit animals like the jaguar or a bird, or having a spirit companion, often also a jaguar or a bird, who would lead them into that other world. So the fact that we see this sort of theme of transformation in these Pre-Classic temples suggests the importance of the shaman at that point in time in Mayan culture. And here too, we see the beginnings of the importance of these very significant ritual specialists in Mayan culture and calendrics. In modern Yucatec Maya language, the word for shaman is Aki, which means day keeper. The keeper of days is the one who watches the calendar and who knows what the meanings of all the days will be in terms of divining the future. So following the Pre-Classic, and the Pre-Classic ended in somewhat traumatic fashion, a collapse that we know much less about than we do the more famous classic Mayan collapse. But the classic, and this is an image again from Apocalypto, Mel Gibson's film, in which the skies are very dark and gloomy, and the people look up in fear at the shaman ruler at the apex of a temple. There's a period of time, about 600 years duration, when Mayan culture flourished. And certainly this was the period of time at which the biggest Mayan cities arose. Two of these highlighted in the center of the southern lowlands in Guatemala, Calakmul and Pacal. Hundreds of thousands of people would have inhabited each of these sites individually. It's a picture of the biggest pyramid and the heart of the Plaza Temple ceremonial complex in Pacal. And you see the pyramid, very steep stairway, and below it a long row of upright stone slabs. Those are the stelae that I mentioned earlier. Well, I'm going to leap here into an area of Mayan cultural development in the classic period that takes us directly into calendrics and Mayan notions of time. And in order to talk about time, we need to talk first about Mayan cosmology. Mayan cosmology was in itself an utterly fascinating topic. The Maya perceived their cosmos as essentially having three basic parts: a heavens, a human world, and an underworld. But this was a multi-layered cosmos. There were 13 levels to the upper world, to the heavens. There were 9 levels to the underworld, which was a watery underworld, and you can see a representation of this watery underworld here in this classic period glyph. And all of these layers of the cosmos were unified by one thing: the world tree. Sort of the axis mundi, the world tree is what connects essentially the human realm to the divine realm. And it was ultimately the shaman ruler's role to perform the function of the world tree for his or her people. The Ceiba tree is an image of a Ceiba tree in the Mayan rainforest. These trees are still viewed as sacred by many Maya today, and they were living symbols of that constant presence of the heavens, underworld, and human world unified together. The Mayan rulers of the classic period, in very clear-cut ways, tried to capture this symbolism in their own monuments and in the artwork that they had commissioned to talk about themselves. This is a very famous sarcophagus lid of a ruler named Lord Shield Pacal, the king of Palenque. He was king for some 70 years, and when he died, he had this image of him inscribed, actually probably well before his death he had this done, and what it shows is him being, actually many people think it's a picture of him ascending into the heavens. The heavens are depicted. There's a bird figure up here, and here's the world tree, but it's actually a picture of him descending into the underworld. The maw of what's known as the earth monster is open up here to take him in. This is all part of the process whereby the Mayan ruler becomes divine, becomes essentially a god upon his or her death. The Mayan ruler combined sort of civic governance and religious duties. In the pre-classic world, the shaman ruler used his abilities to transform him or herself in order, or otherwise enter an altered state in order to communicate with the supernatural. During the classic realm, the Mayan ruler usually goes about communicating with ancestors or with gods through sacrifice. And the most important method of sacrifice was actually not the heart sacrifice that you see so much of in media, especially films like Apocalypto, but rather auto-sacrifice or bloodletting. Only Mayan nobility could do this. This is an image of Mayan kings and queens drawing a knotted, probably yucca thread covered with the spikes of the maguey plant through their tongues. First they would incise a hole in their tongues, probably with an obsidian blade, and then they would draw this thorn-covered cord through that hole. It sounds gory, and it would have been, and this would have been something that they learned how to do at a quite early age. That blood would then soak down and saturate either cloth or paper, and then that would be burned. And from that burning would arise the vision serpent, which would lead them to their ancestors, to the gods, and they would perform that very important role of the shaman. And what that role appears to have been, moving back briefly to the world tree here, is maintaining the balance between the different layers of the cosmos. By pleasing the deities through sacrifice, that balance of the cosmos would persist. Without it, they thought that the cosmos would be in trouble. So in the classic period, the ruler keeps the cosmic order by making these sacrifices, essentially becoming the world tree, not just figuratively but literally, in a way that linked our world with the upper and underworlds and allowed us to communicate with the gods and ensured their ongoing goodwill towards humankind. So classic period Mayan calendrics. There are many scholars today who think that these shaman rulers were in large part essentially libraries, walking libraries of calendric knowledge. And a lot of this calendric knowledge focused on the movements of the major celestial bodies. Before talking about that, I want to I'm going to show you some pictures of Mayan glyphs. And I want to just quickly show you an example of what a Mayan glyph is that will then allow me to talk about some of the major calendric evidence that scholars use. This is a glyph describing the name of the king of Palenque, Lord Shield Pacal. It's his name glyph. And this is that same glyph broken down into its components on the left-hand side, and the component of the glyph that's in white is the one that's described in the text on the right. The small glyphs in the upper left, that's what's known as the superfix, that describes this lord as the sun-faced one. The glyph that looks like a shield here is just that. It's an image and a word for shield. There's a glyph in the upper right, which is actually a phonetic sign. The Maya combined symbols that essentially had a pictographic component to them. They looked like what they meant, with symbols of actual phonetic units. That's a phonetic unit for the syllable pa, the one right below it, the syllable ka, and the final one in the lower right, the syllable la. So you put all those together, and you have Lord Shield Pacal La. You drop the last A, which is a convention in Mayan hieroglyphs, and you get the word Pacal. So that's sort of a very, in a nutshell, how Mayan hieroglyphs look. They are composite. You have multiple symbols, each with its own separate meaning, that make up the bulk of Mayan writing. Now that we're all experts in reading Mayan hieroglyphs, let me take you to Mayan numerology. The Mayan numeric system was actually a genius in its simplicity. They used single dots for 1, and they used bars for 5. And everything beyond that point is it sort of follows from that. So 1 dot has a value of 1, 2 dots has a value of 2, and the figure right there in the middle between the 2 dots is sort of a filler. It's not actually a representation of a number. So typically in Mayan hieroglyphs that are talking about calendar dates, you see a combination of the sorts of glyphs that I just showed you with representations of numbers. So here we have 1 and then a bar, that's 6. 2 bars is 2 values of 5, that's 10. 13 is an important one. You have 2 bars and 1, 2, 3 dots. That represents the number 13. So, not to assume that this gives you some deep familiarity with Mayan writing and numerology, but I think it'll be a little bit helpful in looking at some of the evidence that we're about to talk about. There are 3 major calendars in the Mayan world in the classic period. And these are the Zoeken, the Hab, and the Long Count. This is an image of the Zoeken, and what the Zoeken is essentially a sequence of the numbers 1 to 13, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, going around this circuit here, with 20 day names. And these are glyphs that represent the 20 day names. So you have 13 numbers and 20 day names. And those cycle so that by the time the number 1 and the glyph that it began with reconnect, 260 days will have passed. Now each of these glyphs has its own particular symbol, which there are variants of them in fact, and its own particular meaning. Day name meanings were diverse, but many of them referred to deities, to very important gods like Itzamna, the creator deity, to the god of sacrifices, to the jaguar god, the maize god, maize is another word for corn, the death god, Venus god, the old moon goddess. These are some of the preeminent deities in the Mayan pantheon. But the day name meanings also had more subtle connotations. Senses, earth, flint, rain, sun, death, wind, darkness, that could connect and interconnect with the meanings for the deities in ways that would prove to be of great importance to prognosticators, to shamans. And then the Zoeken also had significance for the cycle, for the agricultural cycle in the Mayan world. From the very beginning of preparing your field, your milpa, to the time when you soak the maize that you've harvested in preparation for cooking, the Zoeken also helped calculate that cycle. The origin of the Zoeken, their scholars have many different ideas about this. One of them is that 260 days pass between the first clearing of the field, the milpa, until the burning of felled forest, and then 260 days beyond that from planting until the harvest period. So the farming of the milpa, what you do is you would cut down a chunk of rainforest, you would let it dry out, you would burn it, you would then prepare the soil for planting. And so it took a very long time. It was the cycle. You had to have several plots of land under development at the same time in order to make it work. Or 260 days from the first missed menstrual period to birth. The Maya would certainly have been aware of this, the major human life cycle sequence. Or in just this one particular part of the Mayan realm in the southern lowlands, there are just about exactly 260 days between solar zeniths. It's only at 15 degrees latitude in a portion of the Mayan world, their heartland. Or, in one of my favorites, the moon. It has nothing to do with the sun at all, but rather the lunar cycle. The moon appears and waxes for 13 days, then wanes for 17 days. So you've got the 13 days of the Zoeken, and then 13 plus 7 totals 20. You've got the 20 day names that those 1 through 13 numerals coincide with. And then it's followed by 9 days when the when the moon sinks down into the underworld. So there are lots of sort of natural phenomenon and also celestial phenomenon that coincide in interesting ways with this particular calendar. In many respects, this might be one of the most important calendars in the Mayan world, and that's in particular because of the uses they made of it. It was the primary tool of what's known as the daykeeper, the shaman with incredible calendrical knowledge. We have evidence in those few remaining codices, the books that were left to us, the Spanish forgot to burn, of the Maya, that the Zoeken was used to calculate the movements of the sun, the moon, Venus, probably other planets as well, the Pleiades, Jupiter. Certainly it was used to calculate the solstices, the zeniths, eclipses, meteor showers. And those celestial predictions, in concert with the agricultural cycle and significance of the Zoeken, and also the various names of deities and associated meanings, meant that this was a very complicated body of knowledge that could be useful in predicting the future. So a very long sequence of initiation and learning went into the creation, the education of a daykeeper. This is a person with vast resources and status and prestige in the Mayan world. The second calendar of note is known as the Hab or Veg year. This is the solar calendar. It consists of 18 months. Each of these 18 months is 20 days in length. And again, you have a sequence of symbols and meanings associated with each of these days and numbers. Just a few of them listed here. Obviously, the solar calendar that we're aware of has 365 days. Their Hab also had 365 days, but obviously you don't get 365. When you multiply 18 by 20, you get 360. They added a 5-day period known as the Wayab, with this period of 5 unlucky days at the end of that cycle to complete the solar year. So they were certainly aware of the true solar cycle and had adjusted their calendar to suit that. Again, you see an astonishing array of meanings associated with months, just like you did with days in the Zoeken. Month name meanings often in the solar calendar refer to rituals and ceremonies, as well as a variety of other things, including elements of myth, animals, plants, planets, seasons, etc. Some of the diversity of these meanings: the flaying ceremony, the first sun ceremony, feastings, the concept of a skull, tortillas, stew, monkeys, iguanas, bats, jaguars. The meanings of month names were every bit as diverse as the day names and represented as equally complicated and complex a body of knowledge that would have to be harnessed by the day keeper. Now, all of these associated meanings of the days, of the months, were useful in prophesying the future and divining the future because of their expected repetition. It's the cyclicity of the Mayan calendar that allows the daykeeper to predict the future. But this is not simply, when people think about prophesying the future using the cyclical calendar, they often have a notion of time sort of repeating itself. And this is not sort of a Bill Murray Groundhog Day kind of event. Things don't repeat themselves in quite that way. Rather, days come around again, and the associated deities and other meanings come around with them. But actual events that happened on those days in the past, they lose their specificity. Instead, they become more generalized types of human experience. So emotions, joy, misery, a sense of abundance, a sense of burden. Calendar dates then take those ideas, those types of human experience, and they carry them with them. So the skill of the daykeeper, the skill of the prophet is in understanding all those possible permutations of days and numbers, and understanding what they mean and how they can best be anticipated, what sorts of sacrificial practices can best be used to ensure that things come out as best they possibly can given the circumstances. And so really what you see is not events repeating in Mayan history, but patterns of events. There are two examples of this we know of because we have Spanish records of them. one is the Mayan resistance to Spanish rule in 1546. They referred back to their calendars and saw that in the past Mayan peoples had revolted against their Mayan overlords, and they thought that this would then be a wonderful opportunity to resist in a similar way, but in this instance against the Spanish. Now similarly, 100 plus years after that, the Itza Maya decided to capitulate to the Spanish because it was in that particular stretch of the calendar that they knew that hundreds of years earlier a major Mayan power had capitulated to invaders. So there's the sense of Maya people and daykeepers looking into the past, and that past informing their expectations of what would be coming in the future, which allowed them to divine the future. Now here's where things get interesting. You combine the Zoeken, the 260-day calendar, with the Hab, the Veg year, and you get what's known as the calendar round. In this particular instance, a combination of numeral day name, numeral month name will only repeat itself every 52 years. This provides yet another permutation and another a way of grouping names of days and months and all their associated meanings that will sort of amplify the ability of prognosticators to get a clear sense of the future. So anybody familiar with astrology knows that the more complex the cycle is, the more smaller subcycles it includes, the more nuanced the astrological reading. And that's essentially what the Maya were so skilled with here. Of course, they didn't view it negatively as we might view astrology today. It was a key element of their astronomy as well. They combined astronomical precision with religious and cosmological meaning. The typical lifespan of a Mayan, that's a very good question. We know that certainly it was very different for Mayan royalty and Mayan commoners. Well, certainly the one individual ruler I mentioned, King Pacal of Palenque, he ruled for 70 years. He lived for 80-some years. So this was an individual every bit as long-lived as folks can hope for today. But most people, certainly, their life expectancy would have been considerably less than ours. I don't have an exact figure for that, but certainly less. It's certainly possible that they would have seen some of these cycles come to fruition. Just a few other cycles that they used the Zoeken and or the calendar round to compute. The stations of Venus could be calculated using the Zoeken in particular. 9 lords of the night, deities associated with probably lunar periods. So those are the cyclical elements of Mayan calendrics, the elements that the Mayan used primarily for prognostication. The long count calendar has been referred to as their linear means of calendrics. In fact, it too is a cycle. It's just a very, very big cycle that seems linear because when you look at it, all you can see is the straight line proceeding ahead of you. If you go far enough, it cycles as well. The long count calendar, it turns out that the long count began before the classic period. But for the Maya, the classic period was certainly the period in which we see the greatest number of long count inscriptions. And these appear often as not on very large monuments called stelae, which I mentioned earlier. It's an image of a stele here, and you can see glyphs on the left, and if you can make out numbers in those glyphs as well. Now, the long count calendar consisted of multiples of 20, with the exception of the tune, or where they made an exception to accommodate the solar year. But essentially what you have making up long count dates are at the smallest unit, the keen, or day. The winal is essentially a month of 20 days. The tune is a close approximation of the solar year at 360 days. The Katun is a 20-year period of over 7,000 days. And then finally, the Baktun is the largest period that we know that the Maya actually used a written term for. They did have other bigger cycles, and that was 394 years in duration. Most long count dates include those 5 components to give you a number. Can't really make out the words in this one very well, but this is a representation that shows that the Maya not only had the Baktun, but probably also had some very other large cycles, much bigger than that, which we'll come back to in a minute here. This is one of the most famous representations of the long count. It's actually not on a stele, but on a jade ornament. This would have been an ornament that probably would have hung about somebody's neck. And the inscription is recreated here on the right, and the boxes surrounding each of these glyphs and associated numbers separates the different components of the calendar. So what you have at the beginning of almost every long count date is a glyph at the top of it, which is sort of an introductory glyph. It says, I'm about to give you a long count date, essentially. And then the numbers begin below that. But the Maya actually, in converse to what I just showed you, the Baktun always came first at the top, and you read from the top down. So you have the Baktun, you have the Katun, you have the Tun, the Renewal, and the Keen. That's the long count date. Then they would append to that date the day signs and the week signs and the month signs for the calendar round, for the Zoeken and the Ha. So here you have the number and the day sign for a particular day in the Zoeken. They could incorporate, they could include or attach a variety of other events, including lunar periods. And finally, below that, at the very bottom here in the red box, what you see is they're finally getting to the story of what actually happened on this day. One of the most famous stelae in all of the Mayan world and Mayan history is Stele C at the site of Quirigua. And the importance of this stele is that the long count date that it shows gives the Mayan creation date. You flip this stele around, you don't do that, you walk around to the back, and what you see are the hieroglyphs showing the date. And this is, for better viewing purposes, a recreation of the long count glyph. So at the top again, you've got the introductory glyph. You get the Baktuns, 13 Baktuns. So there's the number 13, the 2 bars and the 3 dots, and then a glyph which represents Baktun. 0 Katuns, 0 Tuns, 0 Renals, 0 Keen. That's the long count date. Then you've got the Zoeken date and the Hab date to produce 4 Aha, 8 Kunku, the calendar round date. And then the final glyph lets you know that they're about to tell you the story of what actually happened then. And that story is the story of creation. On this date, 13 Baktuns, 0, 0, 0, 0 after that. 3 stones were set. When the Maya build a house, the first thing they build is the hearth. That consists of 3 stones that are symbolic of the 3 elements of the cosmos, the upper world, the human world, and the underworld. Then it goes on to say that these 2 gods, Stingray Paddler and Jaguar Paddler, versions of creator gods, placed these 3 stones in 3 separate places: the Jaguar throne, the Serpent throne, and another one, and that at that point the 13th Baktun was complete. This is the creation event of the Mayan cosmos. Okay. Well, what we know essentially from these and other stelae depicting the creation event is that we are in the midst of a 13 Baktun great cycle, which extends some 5,125 years. Let me show you what that looks like broken down. And on the left, you have the long count date. Again, Baktuns, Katuns, Tuns, Renals, Keen. And then the correlation in our Gregorian calendar of the date when that long count date corresponds to. So the first one, August 11th, 3114 BC. The final one, December 21st, 2012. Now here's the thing. I just showed you a stele of the creation date. Did it give us that number? No, it did not. It gave us that number. The Mayan used this number to refer to creation. That seems a little counterintuitive, but not if it is at once the date of creation and the completion of a previous great cycle consisting of a previous 13 separate Baktuns. Okay, this leads us into this whole 2012 business. The classic period Maya mentioned the date December 21, 2012 exactly how many times do you think? The classic period Maya. How many times do they mention that date that we have evidence for? Got some good guessers in the audience. Exactly once. This is Tortuguero Monument 6, the classic Mayan site. This is one part of a larger stele, sort of an odd T-shaped stele, and this is where the classic Maya mentioned December 21st, 2012. And they say the 13th Baktun will end for Aha 3 Kankin. That's the combination of Zoeken and Hob dates that gives us a calendar round date. It's a damaged stone, so a lot of the glyphs are actually rubbed out and they can't be interpreted, they can't be read. That's what the question marks refer to. Something will occur. It will be the descent of Palenque. This is decipherable to the what? Palenque is a deity, an important deity in the Mayan pantheon associated with war and destruction. Of course, the Maya associated a great many things with war and destruction, it turns out. But this particular deity appears to be descending on the 13th Baktun. Now, this would seem highly significant if you weren't also aware of the great number of Mayan deities and the frequency with which they interact with Mayan royalty, Mayan shamans, at various different calendric intervals. So this is what we know from the classic Maya. We know that on the 13th Baktun, this deity will be involved in something. No mention there of the end of the world. No mention there of the creation of a collective consciousness, sad to say. Now, it's true that there's one other piece of evidence, but it's not from anywhere close to the classic period. The Chilan Balam of the Chumayo is a village in an area of where Maya live today. The Chilan Balam is a text that was written around 1775 in Guatemala by Mayans. It's an image of what it looks like. And this text has a prophecy for the Katun ending, not the Great Cycle ending, but the Katun ending, which is a mere 20 years as opposed to 5,125. And the Katun that ends in this particular combination of Zoeken and Hob days, Kan Ahau Katun, Katun 4 Aha. That comes around every 256 years, so 1500, 1756, and 2012. Now, the world didn't end on either of those two dates, so I think we can be optimistic here. But what this text says is the Quetzal shall come. The Quetzal is a bird of great value to the Mayan culture. The green bird shall come. Canal, he of the yellow tree palette place shall come. Blood vomit shall come. Kukulkan, also known as the feathered serpent, or Quetzalcoatl, shall come. The word of God, the Itza Mayan people, shall come. So what's in parentheses there are interpretations or translations of the Mayan text. It's suggestive that something is going to happen at the Cancun ending in 2012, but again, no mention of the types of things that are so much alive in the media and popular imagination today. So there you have it. Those are the two pieces of evidence for what the Maya supposedly think about 2012 and its significance. Okay, now two pieces of archaeological evidence in response to the notion that the Maya actually thought that people were not around before the beginning of the current cycle in August 13th, 3114 BC, and won't be around after its end on December 21st, 2012. Piedras Negras, a major classic period Mayan site, has a very famous monument known as Altar 1. It's an artist's rendition of Piedras Negras, and you see the temple here and the stele at the base of that temple below. And on one of those stele, this is a drawing of the hieroglyphs on it, and you see numbers that are translatable to the date described here. September 7th, 4691 BC, 9 Baktuns were completed. He, name unreadable, witnessed it, the Holy Piedras Negras Lord. It happened at, name unreadable, probably a place name. What that says to us is that on this date, some 1,000 years plus before the supposed beginning of creation date, there were already people around. And in fact, the Lord of Piedras Negras, and presumably his city as well, were around as well. This continues. 4 Baktuns later, on 4 Aha, 8 Kumku, the 13th Baktun ended. So he's talking in the future about the creation date of the Mayan. So what that tells us is that the Mayan people who wrote this glyph of Piedras Negras, which was occupied, a city that was occupied in the classic period, so it was not occupied at this time, but they were hearkening back to a date far before the culmination of creation. Okay, so that's what happens before the beginning of the Great Cycle that's of such interest in the 2012 controversy. Now this is another stele from the site of Koba, big pyramid temple at Koba. And this is an image of the stele, Koba Stele 1. And you can't really make it out very well in this image here, but what the red rectangle there contains is a very long list of numbers. And this is that list broken down. You've got the top of it here, and then it just starts up again here and keeps on going. Now, look over here, and you can see Keen, that's the day, Renewal, that's the month, Tun, that's the 360-day period, Katun. Pictun is a word here which is actually, it's essentially the same as Baktun in this usage. The numbers don't stop there. That is a whole lot of 13s after that. Let me show you what the translation of that is essentially. So okay, again, 13 Baktuns, 0 Katuns, 0 Tuns, 0 Winal, 0 Keens is the creation date as seen in some of the Mayan stelae that I showed you already. The Koba stele tells also of that same creation event, but provides a date that's a bit earlier. That first 13, again, to the left of the zeros is the Baktun date, which puts it at 33, sorry, that's a typo, it should be 3114 BC. Each subsequent unit, separated by a decimal point, is 20 times the value of the one to its right. third one, we are already at 2 million years and counting. So this is not the Maya saying we were around billions and billions and billions of years ago, probably. What they are saying is creation occurred then, and we can reckon time thinking of cycles that extend so far beyond the Bakhtun that we are all concerned with today as to make it seem trivial. So the Piedras Negras altar date shows an event both before and after creation. The Kobah stela shows that the Maya were aware of time cycles that extended beyond anything that current day folks concerned with 2012 are aware. All right. When you think about those dates and the time periods that the Maya were using here, and the calendrics that they used, and the cycles of time that they were aware of and manipulating, a lot of scholars have turned their attention to the political power that might have arisen from this capacity. And so this is a very good example of this, and I take us back to Palenque because we've already met its ruler, Lord Shield Pacal. At the Temple of the Inscriptions, this famous building there, is a very dense panel of hieroglyphics, and the areas highlighted in red are long count dates that I want to talk briefly about. This is those same chunks of glyphs and dates represented here. What these dates show is, so this is a scribe recounting some pretty key elements of the life and times of the ruler of Palenque. This particular one talks about when Chichen Pacal, divine bone lord, became king. The number that it provides is one pictun. It's the symbol for pictun here, and then the number for one there. That is a chunk of time, some 1,247,652 years after an individual, a deity known as Zero Square-Nosed Critter, acceded to the throne. So there's some interesting stuff going on here. First of all, Pacal's scribes are connecting him to a date that's of astonishing depth. And second, what he's doing is connecting King Pacal through this calendric date to a god. And funny name notwithstanding, the political importance of connecting yourself to a god is inescapable. So these were not sort of innocuous or purely mythic dates, these very, very, very distant dates, whether in the future or in the past. They referenced events and people or supernatural entities that played an enormous role in amplifying the legitimacy, the political influence, the power, the prestige of the Lord. Okay, well that's the long count. That's all I wanted to talk about the long count right now until possibly question period. I want to talk briefly about, I see I'm running over in time here. I'm sorry, I haven't been watching too closely. I want to talk, this is a good time to end, Neil.
Sure, you want to finish up.
Okay. Let me try and consolidate this here by talking a little bit about the Katun ending. Now, the Katun, in comparison to those long count dates I've been talking about, is a pretty measly thing. It's a 20-year cycle. Represents the ending of each Katun. After the Classic period, at the end of the Classic period, Mayan southern lowlands civilization collapses in a pretty catastrophic way. There's huge loss of population. A lot of the major cities like Pacal, Copan are abandoned ultimately. Mayan civilization continues in the northern part of the Mayan region in the Yucatan. And there, long count dates are no longer used. They're no longer inscribed on stelae. But what the post-classic Maya, that's what that period is entitled, do is focus on the Katun, this 20-year cycle. And in many ways, this becomes the most important cycle ending for the Maya during that period. And in looking at how the post-classic Maya used the Katun endings, a lot of scholars are now thinking about the possibility that maybe classic period Mayan folks also were keenly interested in the Katun. That we essentially have been placing so much emphasis on the long count that we've neglected possibly this equally important cycle simply because it's of shorter duration. And in the Katun ending, a very central role is played by the daykeeper or the shaman. Just tell you a little bit about what happens in this post-classic Katun round, also known as the Mai. And you can't make this out, but what this shows is the cycle of the Katun, the chunks of time that make up the round, and at each ending of a Katun, the seat of power in the Yucatan Mayan world shifts. This is sort of a remarkable thing. It's essentially a geopolitical rotation of power based on the calendar date. So there's this repeating cycle of 13 20-year periods that makes up the Katun round. Accounts in the Chilam Balam, again that late text written in the 1700s, talk about the use of this Katun round as essentially a calendrically determined major ritual event to impose cosmic order on chaos. Accounts in this text talk about how failing to maintain calendrical order essentially results in loss of humanness. People leave their farms, they become essentially like animals. They run out into the woods, they lose their culture, they lose what it means to be a Mayan. Natural disasters, drought, famine, pestilence are all tied to these losses. And the geopolitical rotation is essentially a way of asserting that the daykeeper and the leaders of the Mayan communities who are assuming power at the end of each Katun wield calendrically legitimate power, wield the power to sustain and maintain the cosmos, and it's through their deep knowledge of not just this cycle, but the cycles internal to it, the Zoeken, the Hab, the calendar round, that make it such an important political tool as well as calendrical tool. So it's really in the Katun round that you see the meshing of political interests with deep-set Mayan cultural ideas about the importance of maintaining cosmic order through close adherence to essentially a ceremonial calendar. Those two things are not separated for the Maya. The politics, the notions of cosmology, the notions of keeping chaos at bay, those are wedded to politics in their calendars. And I'll stop there.
Turn on one set of lights, and if people have questions, by all means. Sure. Questions.
Move up front here. Anybody has questions? Look behind yourselves. I realize that's quite a lot to digest, and I think in probably in future renditions of this, I may cut it down a little bit. But essentially, what I tried to get at there was the heart of the Mayan calendrical system, focusing on the cyclical dates in the Zoeken, the Hab, the calendar round, and also referencing these long count dates that are of such keen interest to 2012 and the controversy surrounding that. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When Pacal ordered his tombstone, or you had said that he made it that it appeared that he goes to the heavens, but really it's going to the underworld. If he wants, I'm thinking he probably wants to become a god. Why would it be the opposite?
Okay, well, a very interesting question. She asked about the one example I used. Lord Pacal, king of Palenque, for a very long time, when he commissioned his sarcophagus lid to be inscribed with his image achieving godhood, scholars today interpret that as him actually descending downward rather than upward. And she's wondering why that would be if he was going to become a god. And the answer is that their division of the cosmos into upper and underworlds does not mirror kind of the value system that Christianity imposes on cosmos. You know, our own, many of our own background, we think of the cosmos as containing not only divisions that for some are more symbolic, that for some are very real, but they also attribute value to each of those. And for the ancient Maya, in fact, in their origin myth, so a lot of the underworld deities seem like some pretty wicked characters, but there is not the same division, easy division of value into sort of good and evil. In fact, both the heavens and the underworld are really part of one realm, the other world, as scholars like Prudence Rice have termed it. And in that respect, it's sort of a unified thing. And in fact, it's the connection kept between all three of those elements of the cosmos that maintains cosmic order. So it's not that he was sort of choosing evil over good. He's still becoming a god, but that in this case involves first descent into the underworld.
Thank you.
Any questions? The end of the classic period is I gave it here as 900 AD, and that's actually sort of the terminal end of it. For many folks, there's a cycle of increasing warfare, famine, diminishment of quality of life in many of the Mayan centers, the leading ultimately to very widespread depopulation throughout that one portion, the heartland of the Maya, the southern lowlands in Guatemala. And he asked about the classic period collapse. And the reasons for that are many, and scholars still to this day debate exactly why that happened continually, whether you're talking about the possibility of internal political corruption, or you're talking about unsustainable agricultural practices. Other scholars say that overbuilding, the use of too much wood to burn to create the limestone plaster that adorns their huge monuments and pyramids, essentially made life in their environment untenable. That there's really almost as many different explanations for the Mayan collapse in the classic period as there are scholars, it seems. And they often appear to mimic too, or at least mirror, what we're concerned about to this, in the current day. So that right now there's a lot of scholarship going on that links climate change and unsustainable ecological practice to the collapse of them. Yes?
Were they able to foretell, is it anywhere that it's been found that were they able to foretell that of their demise, of their low amounts of numbers, if they were able to see a lot or, into the future, were they able to know that something was coming their way for their people?
Very, very interesting question. She asked, were the Maya, given what I've said about their inclinations toward divination and prophecy and the use of these calendrics to tell the future, did they foretell perhaps their own demise or something catastrophic? And the answer is a complicated one. Certainly, for example, they don't appear to have seen the Spanish mountain. So that's a big one. But it's also true, though, that they did incorporate discussion of destruction and catastrophe throughout, because they witnessed that happen all the time. There were historical cycles that the Maya recognized. People who had been through or knew of past generations who had gone through the collapse of previous centers. Warfare was endemic in large portions of Mayan history, so they saw cities fall. they saw their leaders sacrificed. They saw when events conspired to produce more localized downfalls, or even in some cases more widespread downfalls. So there is ample mention of sort of bad things happening periodically, but usually that is always coupled with a sense of renewal. So when they talk about destruction, when they talk about death, they almost always in the next breath talk about rebirth, a renewal. In fact, that pattern is so constant that you get the sense that really for there to be renewal, there has to be death and destruction. Those were two sort of binary opposites, each defined the other rather than being separate or mutually exclusive.
I wonder if maybe by their foretelling, where they maybe think that the Spanish was a higher god, and maybe they saw that as something that a positive maybe for them to grow, when in fact it was the opposite.
Yeah, there's another good question. And actually, leaping to the Aztec here with Cortez, and there's the myth, the very widely heard myth that, or story really, that Montezuma II, the leader of the Aztec Empire in 1519, when Cortez's force arrived, that he thought he was the return of Quetzalcoatl. And the truth is that it's not utterly a myth, and that in fact there is some evidence to suggest that he did believe he was witnessing a major return. This would have been a return of a deity who had returned in the past as well, in the cyclical fashion that all Mesoamerican peoples recognize the cosmos is operating with. But it wasn't that simple either, because it turns out that a large portion of the royalty who owed allegiance to Montezuma essentially rebelled. They were like, how can you carry forth with this as though this was actually our god? They saw through Cortez. They were so it may have been really just this one individual played a pretty incredible role in ultimately toppling the Aztec. Yes.
You said that usually like her question, like you have to like almost like.
I'm sorry, you're gonna have to speak up just a little bit.
Okay, it's almost like her question, like you said, it's an endlessly repeating cycle.
Yeah.
So after like when it says it would probably end in 2012, because it started with 13 and it probably end with 13. Do you think something else would start as well?
Okay, a good question. She's asking, if I misparaphrase you here, let me know, but did the Maya think that something new was going to start at the end of this 13th Bakun? And indications are that yes, they expected life to go on just as it had. They expected a new cycle to begin. I showed you some of that evidence, the dates either far in the past or far in the future, that fall way outside of the current cycle, and show that they were aware of much huger cycles that encompassed all of the time in which humanity has lived, and probably far beyond it in either direction as well. So yes, they did think that other cycles of time were operating and that new things would be coming. The truth is that there's a Mayan scholar, Mark Van Stone, who some of his translations I included here, and he's got a website which talks in great length about this very question. And the truth is that the Mayan text appears to be a little fuzzy on what exactly the new great cycle was going to entail. But there's no indication that they expected that there would be a destruction of humanity and that what began would be fundamentally different from the way that they are living, well, at the time, that they were living in the classic period. So that we don't have any evidence that they anticipated a dramatically new or changed existence. It is likely, though, based on records of their celebrations of the culmination of the first great cycle way back in
3114 BC, it is likely that they viewed this as an important completion, as one which would allow people like the daykeepers to prognosticate all kinds of things, as one which would probably involve deities interacting with the daykeepers and the shamans. So it was a very important ceremonial and cosmological event for them, because it was a major calendar ending, a major cycle ending. But there's no indication that they thought that that would change things for them in a fundamental way. Yes. Right. Well, a very good question. Were there people there already? And yes, there were people there already. Something I should have mentioned in the talk. Those dates, those long count inscriptions that talk about 3114 BC, those were written. Those are essentially people who are on a monument inscribing a date that harkens back into the past. So those were actually written at about 100 BC, the earliest one. So several thousand years after this date. So essentially, they're inscribing the current date, which is 100 BC or thereafter, and then following it with, way back then, creation occurred. Now, to get back to your question about were people there, yes, there certainly were. I mean, scholarship on arrival of Native Americans in the New World is changing daily, but there is every indication that by a variety of routes, people were in the New World now by possibly as early as 20, 30,000 BC. So quite right. Yeah. So, but some of the earliest dates from sites in Chile actually are right about that time. The jury is out, and in fact, one of the things that scholars are moving away from is the notion that people only came into the New World through the Bering Strait land bridge. Now I think there were waterborne routes from Southeast Asia and sort of a wide variety of access points, maybe even from Europe, so that's impacted the dating of early humans. But certainly, when the Maya wrote these dates, these long count dates down, they were writing about something that it was a cultural remembering of an event that they had not actually experienced.
So let's thank our speaker again. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.